All right, I am going to get started. It is lovely, as I said, to have you with us today for Naziema Jappie, who is going to be giving a talk called Institutionalizing Campus Diversity, Key Challenges Facing Higher Education in South Africa. And I am Mary Beth Gassman. I am a professor at Rutgers University, and I also have the honor of serving as the executive director for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, which is sponsoring this event. And I also wanted to say that we are really proud to have Naziema as a visiting scholar with us at the Proctor Institute and also at the Rutgers University Graduate School of Education. And even though we are still sort of in the midst of COVID, we are excited because we have Naziema with us on site for the entire month of April. So we are excited to be able to engage her in a whole variety of ways while she is with us. And you will, if you follow us on social media, you will get to see some of those ways. I wanted to also say that our event is co-sponsored by the Center for Minority Serving Institutions because we thought that was important given the number of minority serving institutions in South Africa. And a big thanks to Natalie Passoff and Brandy Jones, who have been working on this program and the tech for us today. So I want to start by introducing our speaker, and that is Naziema Jappie. And as I mentioned, she's a visiting scholar with us. She has also worked as a school teacher, a national education officer for the Clothing and Textile Workers Union. She's been a lecturer at the ML Sultan Technikon and the Institute of Women's Study, Lahore, I might have that wrong, in Pakistan. She served as the Dean of Students at the Durban University of Technology and the University of Wits between 1998 and 2011. She has over 30 years of experience as an activist and an academic, and I think that is probably one of the most interesting things from my perspective about her. She offers a unique blend in fields of educational leadership and management, student affairs, conflict resolution, and mediation. And her research interests include educational policy, management, and governance in education. And she focuses on social justice issues. And she's received many awards during her career, including a fellowship at the University of Iowa and an Emerging Scholar Award from the Common Ground Research Network at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. So I am really, really excited to have Naziema with us today. And Naziema, you can take it away. One last thing that I forgot to say is that she's going to talk with us, and then afterward we will be taking questions. So put your questions in the Q&A, and we will have about 30 minutes for questions. So please have lots of questions because this is a really, really interesting talk. So Naziema, take it away.
Well, good afternoon, and to the colleagues here in the United States, and good evening to those who are not in the United States, back home in South Africa or around the world. And I want to thank Mary Beth for this invitation to be a visiting scholar at Rutgers. It's a few days now. It's quite freezing cold for me coming from South Africa, but I'm enjoying my stay, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mary Beth. I think it's great to be here, and thanks to the team for organizing and giving me the support for this talk today. I'd actually like to begin by saying that if you see that picture on the slide, that is the University of Cape Town. And the backdrop is the Devil's Peak Mountain, which actually goes into become the Table Mountain. So it's really a beautiful campus, and it's a campus that has approximately 30,000 students. And we are a research intensive university. And you know, University of Cape Town has always been ranking as one of the best universities in Africa. So I'm glad to be part of the University of Cape Town community and to talk to you today about diversity issues that are challenging for us in South Africa at this time. If we could move on to the slide with the introduction. So I'd actually like to begin by saying that it was strange because this morning I received 2 emails, and one of them was from the University of Cape Town and the other from the president of Rutgers, and both of which relate to why we are here today to talk about diversity issues. And I'm hoping to do justice to this topic because there is so much that can be said and debated. So in this talk, I would like to look at the position and the status of diversity issues and initiatives in South African higher education. My task in this regard is to really highlight how and to what extent the ideas, the initiatives or practices around campus diversity have been appropriated and made part of mainstream intellectual and academic discourses in South Africa. It also involves an examination of the social and epistemological conditions of possibility for meaningful research and curriculum practices, staff and student recruitment, student access and success, in addressing the challenges posed by the social diversity on campuses. And when I looked at the diversity strategic planning process for Rutgers University, I saw some of those similar headings. And I thought this is sort of maybe a worldwide issue that people need to start talking about. And I'm so glad I can do this today. So I do hope that this talk will shed some light to the reconfiguration of academic discourses on issues of advancement of especially Black female academics, organizational culture, and utilization of diversity knowledge as South African higher education responds to the local and global imperatives. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a little bit of background for those who don't know, a little about South Africa. I mean, you may have known about apartheid, but exactly what that meant and how we have transitioned into the new, what we call New South Africa. But prior to 1994, education in South Africa was always segregated along racial lines. And the apartheid system of social engineering ensured that non-whites were denied equal access to white institutions and quality education. So the first democratic elections in the history of South Africa took place in 1994. And the government of national unity, which is now the ANC, has been installed. And as the country began moving towards establishing a non-racial society based on a constitution, and I must say it's one of the best constitutions I've known, that embodies equal rights for every person, the need to establish an equitable and effective higher education system became a top priority. This, of course, required a transformation process that was to necessitate the management of cultural diversity and organizational changes within our higher education institutions. So the higher education system in South Africa during apartheid was divided. So we had institutions and schools that were specifically for white children, Indian children, colored children, and Black children. Now let me explain the colored part of it. The colored race classification in South Africa came through mixed marriages. And so we still have to this day that classification. And I'm afraid to say that in some cases, we still have to put down our race. And we are told this is because of statistics. So when that is going to disappear, I have no idea, but we are still classified in those categories. And the higher education system in South Africa is currently in a stage of transformation. What that means is that the institutions started giving access to more students of color. And as you will see, some of the, or you will note that some of the institutions were mainly white institutions, and these were some of the better institutions in the country. And student demonstrations and protests and campus unrest have already been experienced by many institutions since 1994. And I must say that that has not stopped. And you will recall the roads must fall, the hashtag fees must fall protests that we had in 2015, 2016. And therefore much needs to be done in redressing the imbalances caused by the apartheid education system. And although most higher education institutions have changed their admission and recruitment policies and are now reflecting some of the demographics of South African society, but this is mainly in the area of student access. But it's not in the staff recruitment area, and that's becoming a difficult issue. So redressing historical imbalances relating to both staff appointments and student access is therefore an imperative in the South African higher education institutions. So one of the strategies that must be applied to accelerate this change process was what you know and we all know as affirmative action. Yet affirmative action on its own is not the whole answer. It is essential the diversity created by affirmative action that has to be effectively managed by policy and legislation, and of course, using a very strategic management approach. Next slide, please. So when we look at the Constitution, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically the broad aim of the Constitution is to create and nurture a non-racial, non-sexist, non-discriminatory society where all people can recognize each other's differences while at the same time live in peace and harmony. And more specifically, the principles that were entrenched in the new Constitution actually made sure that everybody in the country followed that path to build a united and democratic South Africa and to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. So the Constitution recognizes the rights to equality, regardless of any distinction or difference, or gives no room for any form of discrimination, which by implication promotes a full recognition of diversity. So the redress policies of affirmative action are afforded constitutional protection as mechanisms for promoting equality, defined as the full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. Next slide, please. So we have various policies and different types of acts that came into legislation. And one of those was the Labor Legislation Acts, which defined major types of disputes that could be considered unfair, discriminatory in the way it would be implemented. So unfair discrimination, for example, against employee on arbitrary grounds, including, but of course not limited to race, gender, sex, ethnicity, or social orientation, sexual orientation, etc. But also it was looking at unfair conduct of employers relating to promotion, demotion, or training of an employee, and relating to the provision of benefits to that employee. And also if any employee was refused to be reinstated into work after retrenchment, the Labor Employment Act came into being to actually protect workers in all sphere, whether it was manual work or whether it was in universities, but the Labor Act is one that regulates that. Then we also have the Bill on Employment Equity, which is now the Employment Equity Act, which makes provisions for eradication of unfair discrimination of any kind, especially in hiring, promotions, training, salaries, benefits, retrenchments. It introduces a measure to encourage employers to remove so-called unjustified barriers to employment for all South Africans. And in that way, it will accelerate training and promotion for individuals from historically disadvantaged groups. And it makes provisions for establishment by government of institutions to support, monitor, and enforce planning requirements and resolving disputes. So these include some things like what we would call equity plans or rolling plans with a strong redress emphasis that has to be submitted to Department of Labor and to the Ministry of Education. So complementing these, the state has also introduced institutions to deal with the issues of diversity and the enforcement of human rights. Like apart from the Constitutional Court, we have the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, because the Constitutional Court intervenes in all constitutional matters involving the interpretation, protection, and enforcement of the Constitution, whereas the Human Rights Commission investigates the violations, the human rights violations, and monitors how government protects that. And the Commission for Gender Equity, which I must say, when it began in 1997, I was one of the first people to be on that commission. We kind of went around the world trying to find out what people were doing, and of course landed in America to see what you were doing. And I think we had a lot of things that we could look at and come up with a proper gender equity plan and strategy for the country. And this was, of course, for women in particular, who have been discriminated against on grounds of gender. So also there were two well-known examples of national efforts and promises to advance diversity. In 2001, we had what was called the National Plan for Higher Education, which focused on redressing the disparities within higher education system that was left after apartheid for both students and academics. And the 2015 Staffing South Africa's University Framework, which focused on staffing within higher education system. And of course, both of these plans have been critical in establishing the discourse and practices on diversity interventions. So it's clear that, you know, we have to look at how the new legislative framework has gone a long way in setting the principles and values for enabling environment and represents an indispensable step for democratization. Next slide, please. So this slide, of course, it's just something I put up because I thought we'd like to see what this transformation actually means for us. It's very important. We're still going through certain transformation processes, but the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, as we would say, is extremely important. Next slide, please. So why is diversity so important in higher education? You know, the South African government and all universities have had a long-standing record of commitment to access to higher education for all qualified students to the advancement of equal education opportunities. But of course, in South Africa, like in most places, universities differ in many ways. Some are public, others are private, some are large urban universities, some are research intensive, others are comprehensive. When I say comprehensive, it basically means when we had mergers in the country, when South Africa had mergers of universities, we had universities who were issuing diplomas and there were universities which were issuing degrees. And what the ministry had done was to combine those two institutions to make it comprehensive universities. So for example, if you know the University of Johannesburg or the Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth, which is Gqeberha, you will see that these are comprehensive universities. And then we have universities of technology, which used to be called the Technicons before. South Africa only has 26 public institutions. There are lots of private institutions. There are lots of colleges, and there's also further education and training colleges run by the Department of Education, National Department of Education. So these collective differentiations and diversity among institutions has strengths that help make it more progressive. Preserving that diversity is essential if we hope to serve the needs of our democratic society and of the increasingly global scope of the economy. Similarly, many universities share a common belief born of experience that diversity in their student bodies, academic bodies, administrative staff is important for them to fulfill their primary mission. So providing a high quality education is a priority. The public is entitled to know why these institutions believe so strongly that gender, race, cultural diversity, and all the things we speak about should be one factor among many considered in admissions and recruitments. And the reasons can be, firstly, to diversity enriches the educational experience. So we learn from those whose experience, beliefs, and perspectives are different from our own. And these lessons can be taught best in a richly diverse intellectual and social environment. Secondly, it would promote personal growth and a healthy society. Diversity challenges stereotyped by preconceptions. It encourages critical thinking, which of course we always say we want people to be critical. It helps students to learn to communicate effectively with people of varied backgrounds. And so that is the way we will promote this personal growth. It also strengthens communities and workplace, and education within a diverse setting actually prepares students to become good citizens in an increasingly complex, pluralistic society. It fosters mutual respect and teamwork, and it helps build communities whose members are judged by the quality of their character and their contributions. And it also looks at economic competitiveness, sustaining, of course, the nation's prosperity in 21st century, of course, going into a digital age now, requires us to make effective use of the talents and the abilities of our citizens in work settings that bring together individuals from diverse backgrounds and cultures. And one of the things, talking about these 4 points, the COVID has actually exposed and highlighted us to the vast diversity that actually exists in the various areas. So universities traditionally in South Africa enjoy significant autonomy in fulfilling their missions, and it must be understood that there is no single model of an excellent university. I think we all have excellence within our university, and it's that we need to nurture and maybe look at more areas that need to become excellent. Yet, in South Africa, the freedom to determine who shall teach and be taught was very restricted during apartheid. So post-94, we saw this massification of enrollment of students from underrepresented, marginalized, and okay. So I was saying that, it's important for us to build a healthy and diverse social learning environment that are appropriate for their mission, which depends on the success of the higher education and strength of our democracy. Next slide, please. So I just want to go on to the conceptual framework. I'm not going to delve too much into this, but basically to say, out of a conceptual framework of diversity, because there's been a lot of conversations and debates and workshops around what this means. And we also have some emerging conceptions from various people that I've spoken to whilst doing my research in social justice and looking to what are their approaches to diversity. So insofar as the diversity initiative is concerned, there are certainly different intellectual formations and consequently different intellectual and academic responses. And one of the academics who writes quite a bit on this, Professor Muller, he uses the concept of intellectual formation to refer to a group of persons who share certain epistemic, political, and pragmatic interests, and who, because of this commonality, exhibit a common consciousness. For him, intellectual formations conventionally share an ideology, that is a set of beliefs about social order, in our case, connected to the role of diversity initiatives in a systemic and institutional order of higher education. And then, of course, a social epistemology, a certain conception of knowledge and its relation to society. These constitutive conditions of intellectual formations change as social conditions change. So what Muller does is, in his book, he actually uses the notion of notions of knowledge for and knowledge of to distinguish how intellectuals and academics place and position themselves in a relationship theory vis-a-vis practice, and then knowledge production vis-a-vis the knowledge utilization or policy development vis-a-vis policy implementation. So there are those who feel constrained to deploy a positive or instrumentalist notion of knowledge, knowledge for, that is the reconstructors, and those who lean to the classic view of intellectual work, that they should only and always be knowledge of. These are the critics. So this is a very important distinction for understanding how South African academics position themselves with respect to diversity scholarship. It allows us to conceptualize and locate the existing diversity practices among academia across the sector. So what he, and I will quote what he says, from a pole of pure intellectualism, that is knowledge for, knowledge sake, the disengaged intellectual, through to a pole of pure activism, knowledge for power, so to speak. So with the nuances between interventionism and strong interventionism. So South African diversity scholarship and educational practice has shown increasing swing towards interventionism or instrumentalism. Traditional emphasis on the pursuit of diversity knowledge as part of a wider academic program on race, class, gender studies are giving ways to the workshops type skills-based programs that we have on diversity management and diversity awareness. Next slide, please. So we also need to talk a little bit about, and I will come to how we distinguish between affirmative action and managing diversity. But before that, I just want to say that how higher education institutions interpret diversity is also critical to the mode of content of scholarship or research undertaken by the academia, and how scholars set up their terms for discussing diversity issues shapes their perception and their responses to these issues. And this is what we found as we go along in various meetings and conversations we have, the meanings they attach to diversity. What does that actually mean? And the debates that dominate the interactions between American, Indian, and South African scholars during 3 years of a tri-national diversity project that was conducted by Ford Foundation highlighted an important fact that there can be no single universalizing of a model or conception of diversity that can work effectively in all contexts. So it's quite important that we understand, however, people conceive diversity, it makes diversity become even more diverse in a way. So one of the things that I wanted to say was that in the study done by Ford Foundation, the dominating the American diversity discourses was the assumption that these issues could be addressed within the framework of multiculturalism. This is a highly contested assumption in South Africa, in the context where multiculturalism has become part of a strong legacy of reactionary politics in education. And in South Africa, both multiculturalism and diversity, particularly cultural diversity, have connotations and historical associations with apartheid that cannot be ignored. So we need to understand that, diversity and diversity initiatives has to be within our own context as well. And this has made diversity quite contested in the country to see what diversity has traditionally been associated with race, gender, and culture. And so there's a lot of literature now that's coming up from various areas. One of my colleagues said to me once that when I asked him, I said, what do you understand by diversity? And he said, there is no institutional consensus on this meaning of diversity. He says, perhaps that may not be a bad thing, because diversity means different things to different people at different places. And of course, it was, a lot of people said the same thing. One person even said to me, diversity is like an American word thrown around as though everyone has the same understanding. So I think we need to look at what people think and how they engage in these discussions. So when we talk diversity, we also talk about how we had to have a distinction between what was affirmative action and how we manage the diversity. So in order to appreciate the transformation process, which is now underway, I must say it's like almost we're in the third decade of the new democracy, and I'm still saying we in transformation. But I would imagine these things take a very long time when you are actually trying to bring about the EDI issues into a university setting. And this can happen anyway, even in the corporate sector. I think they are, in fact, I think much easier in saying, we're now going to get a Black CEO, and they will get a Black CEO. Whereas in the university, if you want to change that focus, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of things that have to happen. So it does not work in the same way as the corporate world. So it is necessary to distinguish between affirmative action, diversity, and the main purpose, as you all would know, affirmative action is to basically eradicate discriminatory practices and to promote the skills and the abilities of those who have suffered as a result of discriminatory practices. when President Mandela was around, he was always, he said, in an effort to allay the fears of the white South Africans, he stated that the goal of affirmative action will truly be achieve equal chances for all. And it should not amount to a vengeful turning of the tables of oppression. And I think that is something that we need to really keep at the back of our minds. It's not about being vengeful. It's about making sure that everyone has an opportunity, and an equal opportunity at that. So how do we also then manage this? And managing diversity does not mean controlling or containing diversity. It means enabling every member to perform his or her potential. And this holds implications for how higher education will handle this process for change. For diversity starts with the realization of diverse interests. And it is clear, unlike affirmative action, which is a process for creating diversity, that the very essence of organizations and its culture must be renegotiated, reconceptualized from a perspective other than the dominant culture. So it's things like key aspects in organizational change. How do you manage diversity in creating that has been created by affirmative action? And I came across a research that was done by Jackson and Holvinos, who spoke about 3 development stages on an organization traverses as it moves from a monocultural to a diverse or multicultural one. And if I look at the 3 stages, and I think, the 3 stages can be related to the transformation in South Africa, and we'll have to go through these things. So the monocultural stage can be compared to the apartheid ethos, when the dominant culture was white, Eurocentric, and open discrimination was practiced. And this stage has now been left behind with the dismantling of apartheid system and the election of a democratic government. South Africa is now only entering a non-discriminatory stage, which can be linked to the implementation of its employment equity interventions, affirmative action interventions, which will be put into place and redress all the past imbalances. And I think the country will finally enter its last stage, that is of multiculturalism, which can only be brought about by the acceptance of a diverse nation and the eradication of all forms of discrimination. It is when this stage is reached that a new culture on the country's diversity may emerge. This emphasizes the need for a paradigm shift in attitudes and behavior. The need for attitude change underlies much of the change in organizations today, and therefore it can change and enhance a person's understanding of a situation and ensure that the environment supports that change, and it is likely that attitudes and behaviors will change. Next slide, please. So we also work within a diversity management framework, which is, it has become declared policy in South African government to make access to a quality education. And so firstly, it's about internal pressures being exerted on institutions of higher education to change and reflect demographics. And secondly, it's external pressures. When you have external pressures, a lot can be done. We saw that during apartheid. And external pressures to effect change are being brought to bear on institutions by communities in which an institution operates, and also through new legislation. And so through the Employment Equity Act, which requires now for us to produce equity targets and timetables, which will be monitored and both at local, provincial level, and as well as national level. This is now, of course, resulting in a diverse student and academic and administrative profile within institutions of higher education. However, while it is accepted that affirmative action is the starting point on its own, will just not work, as the diversity that affirmative action creates will have to be. So basically, what I was saying is that unfortunately in South Africa, there are many institutions believe they are applying a strategic management process, but in fact, while they are addressing only one factor of strategic management, and that is of planning, unless all factors we have that form part of a strategic management are addressed, the process cannot operate effectively. And when you look at the diversity management framework, and I don't want to go through the whole thing, but if you see on that slide, you will find its organizational culture. Some of our institutions, even though we're becoming more Black, so to speak, we still have some culture that's underlying and being problematic in our institutions. So, for example, you may have a Black vice chancellor, which is the equivalent of your presidents at your universities, and you may have a lot of Black people in senior positions, but for some reason, the underlying culture seems to be the culture that's been dominant from the past. So it hasn't really changed culture, and that takes a long time. Also, organizational and environmental change, critical to management of diversity, is changing the organization to accommodate the diversity of academic and administrative staff. And of course, that is also, slowly we're managing to get there. The factor that plays an important role in strategic management, and you see this at American universities as well and other universities around the world, is to address the total quality management. Total quality management, which is integral to an organization's beliefs and value systems, must become part of a strategic management process. Then, of course, we in South Africa, as most universities, I suppose, around the world, participative management and decision-making is very important. So when we do consultations, it's consultations throughout the university to make sure that everyone, all the stakeholders are involved. And so when decisions are made, it's a consensus, and people are in different fora making those comments and remarks so that decisions can be made and policies can be implemented. And then resource development. This is regarded as a key element in providing a well-educated and well-trained workforce in the new South Africa. And of course, the last one is strategic planning. And we all know, and I don't want to go into detail about strategic planning, but it's a factor that provides direction for institutions and is future orientated, but should never be regarded as more important than other factors in a strategic management process, and therefore should not be applied on its own. The process of strategic management, on which management of diversity is dependent, requires an interaction with all the other factors that I've spoken about. A change in one factor or a factor which is not addressed will result in changes in other factors and the effect of the process, of strategic management as a whole. I want to just show you two slides that talk about initiatives and practices. The next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the initiatives that Wits University has put up. So this is an example of UCT, and I want to talk a little bit about UCT because that's where I come from. The transformation agenda here has been, includes the increase of diversity of staff and students, and also the development of inclusivity practices at UCT. And the transformation is a well-advertised priority at UCT, and UCT has adopted a twofold approach. One of redress and healing, which is from the past. And, it involves an understanding the unjust circumstances left by apartheid and the setting the right situations that people have from certain group. And healing, of course, refers to us moving forward into a better future and emphasizing forgiveness as a way forward. The university, values its efforts on improving the percentage of Black so-called academics, and especially a percentage of women academics, Black women academics. And as of 2018, we had about 44% of the academics who were women, and their commitment to an increase in this number as part of the strategic plan. And if you go to our website, you will find a Vision 2030, which our Vice Chancellor, Professor Pakeng, has put her efforts into this, together with the university, the Senate, the Council, to really provide effective support and encourage collaborative thinking, consensus, and also leadership at the University of Cape Town. And this is all done, although we find that we have different views, but at the end of the day, although there are many who may question the effectiveness of various approaches, various surveys, various things that we've done, we are always there to address the systemic issues and the institutional processes. Despite the considerable progress, of course, as I was saying previously, complete transformation, it can be proving a bit difficult, especially when your culture, your organizational culture hasn't changed. And there is little change in that. And therefore, we need to understand how we can actually take that forward. And maybe that's something that we should be discussing, how, if there is an example of how people manage to change cultures at institution, it would be a good thing that we can learn from you. And there is widespread perception, of course, that because of major effects of racial discrimination and exclusion under apartheid, efforts of transforming the university have been largely centered on improving equity in terms of race. So that's where we started. That was our starting point. And while a very important and necessary objective, these focus efforts have little room in exploring and addressing the experiences of oppression and discrimination based on other forms, particularly gender. And I will return to the issue of gender. I want to go to the next slide just to basically touch on some of the research and curriculum changes. Next slide, please. So key factors in research and curriculum are very important. It's the slide before that, I think, Natalie. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Developments concerning diversity, scholarship, and curriculum have changed, have been determined by the ways the institutions have responded to three major factors, both global and local. And that one is market pressures, very often related to budget constraints and issues of institutional survival. And right now, South African institutions, due to COVID, and also the amounts of monies owing by students, we have large student debts. And I can talk for my own institution, where we've been having protests recently where students do not want to pay debts, etc. It does become a problem, because it's important for us to understand how we can do things and make sure that we have the finances and the economic know-how to make sure we can provide for the students that we have on our campus. So the market pressures are quite important. And then the changing modes of knowledge production and their impact on institutional programs. And then also moral and cultural concerns, which are related to ongoing transformation processes. So I don't want to go too much into detail on that. What I do want to talk about is diversity as an area of study, which I found was very interesting. And was pointed out by a colleague of mine from Rhodes University that most diversity initiatives are basically faculty dependent. So if people want to do research, they will. There's a lack of a vision or a lack of conceptual intellectual framework for developing a vision, makes it difficult for institutions to link scholarship ideas, programs, and curriculum. As such, I think many institutions have impressionist and fragmented approach to issues of diversity and lack a holistic perspective. For example, there is some cases no systemic attempt to develop a campus-wide approach to curriculum transformation, for example, or diversity-related research. And two main trends emerged in the diversity scholarship and education. One was in institutional research, driven by central structures of several institutions. Attention was primarily given to sexual harassment, affirmative action, and learners with disabilities. And so in some cases, the findings formed the basis for formulation of institutional policies. And so in a second issue, such as culture, race, gender, etc., there were also some studies, and accounts from Rhodes universities, for example, indicated that in the past, issues of gender discrimination, racism, and xenophobia have been the subject of research undertaken, especially in the humanities. So important efforts have been undertaken even at Cape Town University, University of Cape Town, where in the past we've had establishment of an equal opportunities research project, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, which undertook some very useful research to get us to a state where we actually had a project grow out of that, which was called the Africa Gender Institute, which has carried out important aspects of the work of the Equal Opportunities Research Project around gender. And there are several examples, and the University of the Free State, which some of you may also be familiar with, like UCT, also claims to have made considerable efforts to promote research on diversity issues in their institution. We also had the Graduate School of Arts and the Graduate School of Education at the University of Witwatersrand, who have extended their programs to cover the African Renaissance debate. I'm not sure if you've heard about that, but it was really something that was very useful for us to understand around democracy and citizenship. And so, despite an apparent interest in the African Renaissance issues for many people and government's efforts at promoting the new partnership program for African recovery, which was called NEPAD, interest in African studies in some way declined in post-apartheid. And where there is resilience, these tended to be confined to South African studies only. So the diversification of scholarship and curriculum is determined mainly by Western concerns and not by African concerns, and several programs that previously focused on the rest of the continent under apartheid have been basically phased out of many universities. So one has to understand that research is a very important aspect, and research in diversity is an important aspect that we need to consider. Also, diversity in curriculum is addressed in many faculties, such as the arts, education, social sciences, mostly as a component of a broader academic course. Other initiatives relate to student activities that are linked to community-based or outreach programs, like life skills programs, leadership training programs organized by departments of student affairs. And several conclusions then can be drawn from the research done in the light of discussions held by various people. And one of those is, as in the past, there's been a range of courses and modules. And in some institutions, they've made some modules for first-year students compulsory so that they could develop their skills. And also there needs to be a range of centrally driven curriculum initiatives generally focus on skilling faculty for dealing with complexities of the campus environment effectively. So we have to also just understand that campus diversity revisited, we need to put equity and social justice on the agenda. Overemphasis on culture in diversity initiatives has been an object of contestation, and under contention is the emphasis on cultural recognition at the expense of equity issues, as if the problematic of culture difference has nothing to do with social equality. So I think there's a lot that one can talk about against this background. The future of diversity initiative will certainly depend on its ability to integrate theory of cultural recognition and mediation with the theory of social justice. In other words, diversity initiatives require a critical theory of recognition that identifies and supports only those forms of identity politics that can be coherently combined with the politics of social equality. This is an important dimension that has been overlooked in diversity scholarship. Also the history of we have what we call the HBUs, the historically Black universities, which have been categorized so in apartheid, that seem to be relatively slow in advancing diversity. And my first reaction was that diversity was not perceived as an important issue within this institution. And this brought to the fore the question that has been raised several times, whether diversity is being perceived as a key institution or issue in that institution from a subsector of higher education. So from dialogues with scholars affiliated to these institutions, the answer seems to be yes, with the proviso. Note that, however, I base my judgments on accounts provided by the various people I speak to for my research, which I spoke to, very often tainted with some reservations. Note that this is only my personal view, but there are others who feel that these universities are grappling with the negativity of the past and the feeling of disadvantage and the image of being less than other institutions is one of those key things that the HBUs are responding to. And so we need to understand, that this argument here that while there is evidence of transformation and diversity is being explored in all the institution has been somewhat successful with respect to equity and diversity, the efforts remain to be inadequate, and we need to still grapple with some of those issues. Next slide, please. So if you look at this diagram, it's basically going to show you, this slide will show you about strategies within South African universities. And again, there's been many strategies. Research demonstrates that, because government efforts to promote equity, diversity, inclusion have been centered on improving the underrepresentation of Black and female academics in staffing pools and on recruitment processes. This is evident in history of many governments nationwide, in the plans. So we've had, begun with, when we started, we had a program of transformation, which was the Education White Paper 3. You can Google this and you can read up. This paper emphasized that the Department of Education's vision to promote equity of So I was talking about these strategies, and as you can see, these plans have widely helped to increase number of Black and women academics in universities, and have subsequently supported Black women through different strategies such as financial and research support. And all the plans discussed, recognize certain gaps. And so it's important for us to understand, what we need from equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and the requirements for transformation. Transformation efforts have widely helped increase the number of women in universities, as I've said before. And however, the statistics clearly show that Black women are still a little in the minority. And I'm going to just explain, as I said before, Black women, when we talk Black, we talk about Indian, colored, and African women. And so when we look at where are they situated and what they're actually doing, it's not in the very senior positions, and they're mostly contained in the kind of lower level positions at universities, and mostly in administration, I would say. So it's one of those things that we need to understand, what is this Black experience of women, and how, especially in the cases where gender is discussed, and what is the female experience in actually looking at how the Black female experience at university is as opposed to a Black male university experience. So while challenging and bringing the attention to the correlation between the marginalized and diverse intersectional identities is important, the complexity of breaking down the experience of these diverse groups, I don't want to go into it, but South Africa has a rich and complex history with multiple layers that make it challenging to address within this time frame. Therefore, due to I want to just focus, due to time, I want to focus on addressing the challenges that Black women academics experience, and we'll touch on the intersectional levels of marginalization, etc. So next slide, please. On this next slide, I've just put up some questions to ask what are some of the main obstacles that Black women experience, what are the perceptions, and how have the initiatives adopted by, let's say, the University of Cape Town helped to achieve the EDI for Black women, what are their strengths and their limits, etc. And in post-apartheid South Africa, as educational policymakers struggled with one of the most challenging developmental issues facing the government, and that was redressing inequalities. And so it's been something that that does come up. So it's important to note that. And we have, next slide, please. Diversity that challenges Black women academics. You'll see there are a number of different issues that challenge the Black woman in the country, and we know all over the world women always have experiences that they find that the situation is always exacerbated, especially in the areas of science and the STEM areas. And in South Africa, you will find that largely it's still a very patriarchal society where the responsibilities of caregiving, homemaking are disproportionately carried out by females, and also the lived experience of Black females academics, but also administrative staff in universities, to leave the institution, especially when they have kids, they have to stay at home and all of those things. So it can be argued that, people carry different identities that intersect with each other within different spaces and within different power structures. And it is these power structures that create social inequalities for certain groups of people. So it can be argued that for Black women, their situation in the social hierarchy is influenced by their interlocking race and gender identities. And, we talk about the additional triple burden that gets placed on Black women, become a factor. We've had this problem ever since I've been in the trade union movement. We've always struggled with this, with the triple oppression of women in South Africa. Next slide, please. So there are challenges and struggles and the lived experience of women. And these are some of the issues and limited exposure to research. We also spoke to women who said submitting research to a gender-focused journal because senior colleagues viewed such a journal as being a softer option, whatever that might mean. Serious misconceptions about racial and ethnic groups, about each other, and also experiencing certain issues in the university environment. And so that was a serious problem as well. The next slide, actually, if you can put that up, Natalie, gives us just an example. And if you look at that graph, it will show you what are some of, this was a research that was done on barriers that were experienced by academics at South African universities. And you will see some of these issues. And insufficient time for research was one of the most, especially for women, because they could not do much of their research because of all the other things they have to do. And at UCT, I found that while great efforts have been made for the first two elements of EDI, for example, equity and diversity, strategies to promote inclusion are still lacking. Part of the challenge relates to the fact that the first two elements are easier to measure. UCT's transformation strategies quite rightly have prioritized equity and diversity by placing certain sort of quotas for hiring and creating programs and support and targeting Black academics. However, the concept of inclusion is more elusive. Also, I think there are deeply rooted practices of colonization, everyday racism, and institutional structural barriers that are not being prioritized as steps to addressing inclusion within the university. I read research by Hemson and Singh, who wrote about in 2010, and they argue that after many years of formal apartheid, there seems to be in inverted commas, a failure of discourse in addressing the same issues of social relations at institutional culture that have carried over from apartheid. And inclusion needs to be redefined as a separate strategy, not to be mixed in and confused with equity in opportunities and diversifying staff. So I want to actually move on to looking at slide 17, which is addressing the imperatives. And also, if you look at this, what are some of those things that we need to do? We need to have adaptable work environments, conditions of service need to be really looked at, mentoring and coaching for women, Black women, especially at universities. What about policy and remuneration? We all suffer that. I saw a program on Al Jazeera, which was, I think, on stream. And there were 3 Black academics, professors from various 3 universities in the United States. They had the same problem. So this problem is a universal problem, and we seem to have similar issues. And so policy and remuneration was also one of the key areas. I heard someone talking the other day about women in IT, and that even if there are women in IT, they are not paid the same as the males. Now, why is that? And why should it be like that? And that's something that we need to tackle. Gender-based violence, we've had a lot of issues around gender-based violence. And yeah, so and also in recruitment. So, that we need to address these imperatives. Next slide, please. So this is basically just to say what are the next steps. And as you can see, it's the female climbing up the step, not the male. So let's go to the next slide, please. Just the concluding remarks. And I just want to say that, South African campuses have embarked on wide-range initiatives. They are slowly but steadily redirecting their student bodies and their staff bodies to reflect demographics. As I've said, they've developed an increasing awareness in the pursuit of, sort of knowledge and transformation, and also trying to promote diversity and social cohesion, looking at recognition and engagement. You know, and the diversity project has gained momentum in some institutions. However, fragmentation of effort and piecemeal approach still dominates some of the other institutions. In this context, I think the talk reaffirms the need for a leadership-driven integrated approach with an institutional planning framework, which set parameters for targets, priorities, and very clear lines of accountability and responsibility for the diversity project that we want. I looked at the meanings, you know, of diversity programs, and ways in which institutions have reworked these, redefined them, reinvented diversity against the background of the apartheid legacy. So, you know, I think the application of a diversity framework is really necessary, and it will ensure that all aspects of affirmative action and diversity processes within South African higher education are addressed. However, it will take considerable commitment by institutions recognizing the diversity they are creating through affirmative action interventions to begin implementing the necessary steps to achieve a climate in which diversity can flourish. So South Africa as a nation is facing a new beginning, one that will be built on diversity of its people. And I want to end with a quote, which I found by authors Loomis and Sharp, which said that diversity is a celebration of differences and an appreciation of bond unite people. Experiencing diversity is a common component of equality, educational experience to achieve excellence. It is also imperative to achieve diversity. With that, I want to thank you very much for listening to me, and I must apologize for the technical issues, but at the end, I hope this made sense, and I hope you can contribute to it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Naziema. Now, I know that it is very hard when you're giving a talk and there's not an audience, so I'm just going to give you some applause. So thank you so much. And we are going to take some questions now. So we have some in the Q&A. We have a bunch more now. So I hope you're ready, Naziema. I will be asking you the questions, so don't worry about them. So the first one is from Safia, who I think might know you because she seems like it. She says, great webinar. I'm curious about where in the different frameworks that are being advanced are the psychosocial imperatives, belonging and community building of inclusion placed, if at all?
Do you want me to answer it one by one?
Yes, yes. Yeah, that's exactly. Don't even worry about reading the questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll take care of it. So, yeah.
Okay. I think the issue about, you know, in the framework, I think the psychosocial imperatives were not really taken too much into account. I think there is a sense of belonging to a community. I think that is something that South Africa, I think even during apartheid, has always looked upon, of how you actually can belong to a community and building. There was a lot of inclusive work being done pre-1994. And I think, you know, when we got to post-1994, it was like a given that we were part of this community. So I think that's where that comes in. It's not very clearly stated, but it's built into those frameworks.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the next question, and I'm going to do these one at a time. This is from Michael. He says, universities and urbanization have complex economic, political, and historical links. During the 20th century in the United States, two societal trends, deindustrialization and globalization, shifted physical and financial capital away from cities, shuttered factories, and reduced bank local investments. The city has long been a hub for social issues. So as an academic from a Global South University, UCT, can you share your experiences of South African universities? And then the questions are, let's start with this one. Which public and private institutions and cities are most engaged with diversity issues? Let's start with that one.
Okay, so I'm going to talk mainly for the public institutions. I know the private institutions do have diversity programs, but remember the private institutions are mainly based on a kind of commercial venture. So they are out there to make money.
I think
So
it's important for people to know too that the private institutions in South Africa are fundamentally different from the ones in the US. They are mainly not nonprofits. They're typically for-profits, many of them, right?
they
Okay.
are for profit. So whether they have all white students or all Indian students or very few black students, it doesn't matter to them. Yet the public institutions are accountable to the National Higher Education Ministry. So what we call the Department of Higher Education and Training. And, most of them, I would imagine out of the 26, they all have some diversity programs. But the ones that are very key in the diversity areas are universities of like Cape Town, universities of Pretoria. So also you must remember the public institutions were also divided around lines. So you had Afrikaans speaking universities who had to transform and become very diverse sort of overnight. And so if I take in the Western Cape, for example, from where I am, Cape Town, we've got four institutions. So we have an institution that was previously a colored, so-called colored institution, which was the University of Western Cape. Then you had a very liberal English-speaking university, which was the University of Cape Town. Then you had an Afrikaans university, which is University of Stellenbosch, and you had a University of Technology, which was previously the Technicon that was white, and then when the mergers took place, it's now integrated. So basically, they all have to deal with diversity issues, and clearly it's something that universities can't get away with. So I think it's the pace at which they're dealing with diversity issues and how fast they are moving. So for example, if you take Stellenbosch, being an Afrikaans-speaking institutions previously, which was mainly white, which I could not go to as an Indian student in my days when I started a university. I had to go to an Indian university, which was the University of Durban-Westville in Durban. So it meant that those universities had to change. They had to bring in more Black students. They had to show what they were actually doing. And even the language policies are now changing. So where they were previously basically Afrikaans speaking universities, they've now had to change to start teaching in English, because English is of course the spoken language in South Africa, although we have 11 official languages. Don't ask me about that though, because that's another conversation. But at the same time, I think most of the universities, whether they are in the cities or rural, they are dealing with diversity. But as I've said, the Black institutions which are out in the rural areas are a little bit slower because they are Black institutions. And this is what I was trying to say to someone the other day. What does diversity actually mean? Does it mean we have all Black people? Or does it mean we have equal opportunities for all? So it means that if you have an all Black university, is that diversity? Are you dealing with diversity? And I think that's what South African institutions in the rural areas, which were previously predominantly historically Black universities, they are having to grapple with those kinds of things. I don't know if I've answered. Mary Beth, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. The next question is, why is it that urban universities want to be more involved with their host cities?
I don't understand that question, but let me try and answer it.
Okay.
I think when you talk about urban universities, for example, Cape Town, UCT is an urban university, so is the University of the Free State. They're all urban universities, and they have to be involved with their cities simply because of the public-private partnerships that we have with the corporate sector, with the government, with the provincial government, with the schooling. So there has to be that connection. And the same thing happens, I must say, it's not just for urban, it's also for the rural. So universities like the University of Zululand or the University of Fort Hare, which are situated in rural areas, they also have involvement with a wide variety of cities, not necessarily cities that are close to them. So in South Africa, there seems to be a lot of public-private partnerships with the city, with the corporates in that city. And if you say, and I'm just reading the next question, sorry, Mary Beth, what constitutes that engagement? That is for taking students out into the workplace as well. We have to have what we call work integrated learning. So we need the city, we need the corporate businesses in that city to help us to get the students out into the workplace. So when we have graduates leaving the university, we want to make sure those graduates find employment. And UCT has always been good in making sure that the graduates find employment in not just Cape Town, but even in Johannesburg or even in London for that matter. You know, our graduates go all over the world. So there's a engagement that happens on various levels. So we also run, for example, programs for the rural communities in the city. So we will run, let's say, a small, from our health sciences department, our medical students will go out into the rural communities and do work in that community. And they will get examined in that community. They will also give their help in that community. So a lot of different aspects, whether it's business, whether it's health, whether it's in engineering, that constitutes the engagement. And how do South African universities see themselves? I think we see ourselves as being very optimistic for the future. We all have a role to play in our country. And I think it's important that, you know, even though we may have small universities, I mean, University of Cape Town has about 30,000 students, if not less. But at the end of the day, I think we all work together to make sure that we provide the skills that the country needs. And especially the engagement that we have with government in terms of the priorities that are there. And so the South African universities do want to excel. I think they are very competitive, I must say, and they would love to excel and they would love to see themselves grow. And so there is a lot of engagement, and South African universities, I'm very optimistic about them. And I think we have some very good graduates coming out of our university. I'm one of those. I may not be very good, but I'm one of those.
I know, didn't you just get your PhD just a little bit ago?
Yes, I did. And I must say, I also did my fellowship at Iowa University. And I was also very, you know, I like to see what other universities offer. And sometimes when I look at what universities in other countries offer, and I look at what we offer, and I think, we do similar things, you know, but maybe we do it differently because of our context. And maybe because we much sort of maybe newer universities, we have some very new universities in South Africa that have just been established in the last, say, 5 to 6 years, but they are very focused niche areas. So for example, you know, you'll have a university like Sol Plaatjes, which is fairly new, but concentrates mainly on engineering and the STEM areas. So I think we're trying to move towards that.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, a question from Hannah. How can students be more engaged in global diversity efforts so that they can garner a better understanding of DEI in higher education and be active participants in doing the work?
Now, you know, one of the things that Professor Mamdani and I always spoke about was the issue of when he gave a lecture as well, is that what is it that South African students fear the most? And I think sometimes it's about just leaving the country and going abroad. But with technology, it's become so much easier now for our students to become engaged globally on diversity efforts. And so at UCT, there are groups of students that also work on diversity programs, and they are not just involved in with universities in the US or the UK or in Australia, but we've decided also that there should be an African context of diversity so that these students can have a better understanding of what's happening in Africa and so that we can put Africa first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, another question from Michael. He has a follow-up question, and that is, so are the diversity interventions limited to the Black campuses like Marmalade and Pretoria, or UTC and other campuses?
No, the diversity interventions are throughout. All 26 institutions have diversity interventions. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a Black campus. The Black campuses, I think, are much slower in moving. But, you know, so for example, what would be the diversity issues in a Black campus is about how to create a kind of bond between, or bring diversity between the different groups of Black people, you know. So I think those are some of the issues. But to answer your question, the diversity interventions are not limited to Black campuses.
Right. And one of the things about in South Africa is that because there are so many different tribal communities among Blacks, right? So like you can't assume that because you can't assume, for example, that the Zulu community and the Xhosa community are going to be just immediately getting along, right? There are long historical issues. Am I wrong in that, or from my own knowledge, Blackness is like hugely complex, even within the African folks within South Africa, right? And so we sort of assume that it's not complex sometimes, especially for a lot of us in the U.S. So
No, you're absolutely right. It is Blackness is complex in South Africa because it's not about being Black. As I said in my talk, Black is divided also. There's also subdivisions within Black. So just let me give you an example. So I'm an Indian. I have Indian origin, but I was categorized Black and still categorized Black, but the subdivision is still Indian. So if I have to fill in a form and classify myself, I would have to put Indian. Okay, so the form will have white, African, Indian, and colored. It won't have the word Black. Okay, so I can't just cross the section that says Black. So I'll cross a section that says Indian. Now, the employment equity targets at universities, for example, at UCT, it will say preferably a Black candidate needs to apply. So I think of myself as being Black, a Black South African, a Black Indian South African. So I put myself in there and I say, right, I'm going to apply for this job. And when you actually look at the equity targets, let's say in that department, let's just take a department like, I don't know, anthropology or whatever, it may not be, but I'm just using an example. And their target is to get a Black African female. And I've applied as a Black Indian female. I'm not going to get that job if there is a Black African female. So clearly the Blackness is a complex issue. And sometimes I say to myself that I'm not Black enough anymore. So clearly, I think that is where we had a common purpose, remember, pre-1994, where we all fought for the struggle, whether you were Indian, colored, African, white, didn't matter. But you had a common purpose. Now you have a common purpose to move into the democratic phase of South Africa and to move into a diverse phase of institutions. So for me, the issue is about how do you bring that diversity across the different spectrum of people into the university? And that is still a difficult question to answer because people are grappling with that. You may have a very good white candidate, for example, for a job who ticks all the boxes. And unfortunately, when you grade them, A, B, C, the A and Bs you can interview, but the Cs you can't because they may fit all the categories for the requirements of the job, but because the person's white, they don't fit your equity target. Now, that for me is also difficult because sometimes you need competence over and above someone just being either Black or Indian or colored. And you need who's competent for a job, especially if it's a scarce skills position. And so we need to be very careful in how we maneuver through this because we can't just, fool around and say we're just going to take Black people in. We have to also look at the merits of each case. So it's quite complex. It's not as easy as saying, Black is Black.
And when you say Black, you are saying it in the comprehensive way, right? Whenever you.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I talk about the Black with the B, capital B.
Okay. So yeah, because I'm just trying to. So for affirmative action in South Africa, like within higher education or more generally, you would be the categories that would qualify for that would be Black, would be African, colored, and Indian, right?
Correct.
As Black. Okay, because it's so different from what we do in the U.S. that it's very interesting. And then the other thing I was going to say is that affirmative action in South Africa also has it's much more it's much more specific. It's much more, what would you, I want to use the word aggressive in more of a positive way, but it's much more aggressive in its challenge in terms of achieving equity than in the US, where it's sort of like, okay, you know, it's sort of, it's there, but people are slightly uncomfortable, or, you know, with it, and not necessarily even sure how to implement it. I once had a student write her dissertation about how institutions implement affirmative action, and there's very, very little research about how higher education institutions actually implement affirmative action. There's a lot of research about affirmative action, but the actual on the ground implementation of affirmative action, on a, you know, in all the work that we do, there wasn't very much research. This was about, you know, 15 years ago. But so I guess I'm just curious about, is affirmative action embraced by the majority of people? Do you feel like there really has been some equity changes based on these affirmative action policies? I mean, I have seen, when I've visited, and I've been there many, many times for research, I've seen really significant changes in the way that the universities looked, for all of them that I've been on, in terms of students and faculty, but I'm not there on the ground, so I'm kind of wondering.
No, you're absolutely right. I think the right word is aggressive. We had to do that. We had to become aggressive in terms of our affirmative action policies. And if you look on the ground, you will see changes. You will see physical changes of even the management structures at universities, where we previously had mainly white males dominating the university presidents' portfolios or senior managers. Now you have Black males and females. And in fact, increasingly now we have Black female, African female leaders in our university. So I think that has helped us a lot. It's moved us along a lot. And but the issue is still about, what about the bottom, you know, the lower levels? How do you actually change those? Sometimes, you know, some people would tell me, you know what, we have to wait for someone to retire before we can fill that post with someone who's Black. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that come out through the university. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, we are positive in the way we are moving forward. We are positive in trying to achieve some of the goals that we've set out. We haven't achieved everything, but I think in terms of EDI, I think we are moving in the right direction. All the universities have set up offices, and the offices are not just for reporting, but those offices are there because people can actually go to those offices if they have problems. People can actually find ways of working. The offices share information with the university community. The offices of EDI, they would be prepared to run workshops and make the awareness throughout the campus of things that are happening. So I think, you know, we've moved a long way from where we were, Mary Beth.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are, our time has come. And I just, first of all, want to say thank you so much, Naziema. This was wonderful. I learned so much. I hope everyone did. We will be sending out a recording and that includes the whole presentation to everyone who participated. So please put it out there on social media as well, so we can get some more attention to this important topic. And I also want to say thank you to Natalie and Brandy for their tech support. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone for dealing with some of our tech glitches today. You know that happens in the world of Zoom, but I think this was great. And thank you so much, Naziema. We're really happy to have you with us. And, you know, thanks for all your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you to everyone who was listening in. I hope that we can have another conversation in the near future, and I'm glad to be a visiting scholar at Rutgers. So thanks to you, Mary Beth, and your team. Wonderful work. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.